Hello again. So right now we're going to talk about concepts of environmental justice. Before we get started, I just wanted to preface by saying that environmental justice is a concept that encapsulates both the environmental justice movement, where we saw majority African American people start to protest against the unequal distribution of environmental harm in their communities in Texas, in the United States, that has now become a part of broader activism around the world for environmental causes that you can see issues of inequality embedded within. However, environmental justice activism has led to the emergence of environmental justice as a theoretical paradigm. So today we're going to be talking about both of these in the broader encapsulation of environmental justice. So environmental justice as a social movement surrounds the principles of social justice. It's also a theoretical lens that focuses on fairness in the distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, and in the underlying social, political, economic processes that determine the distribution of environmental burden and benefit. So in both the movement and research, environmental justice aims to amplify the voices of people who've experienced injustice. And this is because this approach focuses on how disadvantaged and historically oppressed peoples are more likely to be disproportionately harmed by issues of environmental injustice. And environmental justice has highlighted that ecological equity issues often coincide with broader issues of discrimination, racism, classism, and exclusion. And we'll discuss these in more detail shortly, but above all, environmental justice demands the right for all people to be protected, especially in terms of where they live, where they work, and where they play or experience leisure. And so this concept of environmental justice does not just refer to the natural environment, but these ideas around environmental justice often extend and encompass man-made environments. So that could be things such as your home, your school, or your workplace, or other socio-cultural, economic, and political environments. But at its core, these are the key concepts that underpin the examination of environmental injustice that are seen up on the slide. So an easy way to differentiate between the movement and the theory is that environmental justice scholars analyse resource conflicts, pollution distribution, and decision-making through the lens of environmental justice, while activists aim to create an environmentally just world. So the environmental justice movement in the United States consisted of the integration of two earlier and very significant movements in American history, which is the environmental movement and the civil rights movement. So as you would have seen in the films from week one, environmental justice emerged to counter the mainstream environmental justice movement, which traditionally failed to see the interlinked issues of social justice that were evident in other ecological problems. So in the United States, environmental justice emerged under the idea of environmental racism, which referred to the unequal distribution of both social and spatial injustices and the environmental burdens on the basis of race or ethnicity were evident. So in the case on the slide, this is seen as the founding case that has sparked the environmental justice movement, which was essentially based on the idea that African American communities in Warren County, North Carolina, were being exposed to pollution from hazardous waste facilities due to their race. Essentially, the urban planning of the region was such that spaces were designed so that people of colour were living in hazard-prone areas or high pollution zones, whereas zoning or urban development protected rich white communities from pollution. Now, this is something that doesn't just happen in the United States. I've done research that highlights that this is something that is being experienced in Australia, and other researchers have looked across the world to highlight that those experience social, economic, or cultural marginalisation are often going to be living in high-risk zones, whereas those who are often white and wealthy will live in areas where they have limited to no environmental burden. So you can see how this is an issue of justice that highlights the intersection between racism, classism, and environmental marginalisation. Okay, so just to summarise the case from the previous slide of Warren County, what we found from that activist pursuit was that neighbourhoods within 3 kilometres of commercial hazardous waste facilities had a 56% population of people of colour. And this led to the coining of the term environmental racism by Robert Bullard, who was one of the leading scholars in environmental justice. And through these notions of environmental racism, the field of study expanded to assess broader issues of socioeconomic marginalisation and environmental racism concerns. So what we saw from these early stages of activism was that environmental justice scholarship emerged as a commentary on these broader movements, particularly as the movement started to expand in the 1980s. So we saw not just activism in the context of the US, but a broader international uptake of concepts of environmental justice and environmental racism, which then led to an expanding of this field of scholarship. So historically, scholars focused on community activism and failures of our regulatory or governance systems to protect or give voice to marginalised communities, particularly people of colour. But then we've started to see environmental justice scholarship become focused on other intersecting issues of environmental racism, not just in terms of the burden of pollution in communities, but broader environmental issues and how often an abundance of environmental impacts or effects will be happening in communities of colour or within the communities of socially economic marginalised people. So from this, we start to see the notion of class, race, gender, ability, and how those groups who are marginalised are going to experience the majority of environmental burden and harm based off these unjust social structures that exist outside of environmental justice concerns but are influenced by it as a whole. So the idea of environmental justice has been widely acknowledged from a variety of scholarly disciplines, and that was mentioned in this week's reading by Schlossberg. But the discourse of environmental justice, it has extended beyond its initial focus on racism in the US and how that leads to environmental burden, to now be looking at inequity and the distribution of environmental risk more generally. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So hopefully you all have read this source. It gives a very broad overview of the theories of environmental justice and also its emergence, but also the limitations of this approach and what needs to happen to address our burgeoning environmental concerns as we move on socially, culturally, into the present generation where we're seeing more than ever widespread issues as a result of anthropogenic climate change. So the key focus of environmental justice as a theory is on the unequal distribution of impact of environmental damage. It is suggested that those who experience the majority of environmental injustice are people who have experienced intersecting social inequities such as poverty, social marginalisation, or people who have historically experienced discrimination, the absence of legal rights, or socially or politically grounded practices of domination and control. So in this sense, environmental justice is the link to issues of social justice and often the denial of basic human rights that then we see intersect in these environmental injustices. So while the formation of notions of general justice were based on the idea of environmental racism, we are seeing that the environmental justice paradigm has expanded to include these broader issues of social inequity and denial of human rights. And this has demonstrated how demographic factors often increase one's exposure to environmental bads or burdens. And like I said earlier, people of colour, gender marginalised groups, class-based marginalised groups, people with disability are often those who are at the forefront of this unequal distribution, which is a key focus of environmental justice scholarship. And that's how you can recognise an environmental justice stance. Think about the focus on a marginalised group and how they experience the unequal distribution of environmental harm. And that is essentially an environmental justice focus and argument. However, environmental justice as a concept in research is increasingly considering how environmental justice arises from pre-existing processes of human exploitation and domination. So think about how think about our capitalist development practices in the West, how that is based on the idea of forever expanding, forever taking our resources to expand our economy. But think about how that actually impacts the bodies of those in developing nations who are the ones undertaking the majority of labour, but are also who are taking in the majority of burden. Think about sweatshops in developing nations, how they are housing people in unsafe conditions to make our garments, for example, to make our items from various factories, our phones, etc. How they are being exposed to terrible working conditions, but also the environmental burdens of those productive practices, all to grow our wealth in Western industrialised nations. And we as consumers are consuming these goods at a rapid rate, which is increasing, obviously, pollution and also capitalist production. The cycle builds inequality and also environmental burden, but is based on practices of colonial exploitation. Human exploitation. Also think about colonial exploitation. So you can't really look at environmental injustice without thinking about colonization. Our expansive practices, when we think about Eurocentric expansion and imperialism, was all about taking resources from nations that were deemed as inferior from a Western Eurocentric standpoint, taking their natural resources to build the economies of Europe and in general in Western nations, if we look at post-colonial production as well. So think about the exploitation that happened to workers under colonialism that led to the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of our economies. But this also bred class inequalities. It also bred land dispossession, and also this was all based on racist ideologies that have now contributed to, obviously, our modern day system where we have environmental degradation in countries who are in developing countries or the global south. And often this has come at the expense of those people to build our economies. Again, originally these practices began from colonization. As colonization continues today when we think about resource extraction in Australia on First Nations people's land. So we are taking natural resources from country that have various cultural significance to First Nations people in Australia. We often deny them human rights, land rights, in order to increase our expansion. An example of this would be the Adani Carmichael mine, if any of you are interested in looking into that for your essays. That is a clear examination of a neo-colonial practice of domination and control that is leading to environmental justice issues and exploitation of First Nations people. Again, we can't look at the environmental justice paradigm without also looking at capitalism as the dominant model of economic development. So EJ scholars scholars argue that capitalist expansion that stresses limitless growth is a human rights issue, particularly in countries in the global south or marginalised groups in Western industrialised nations. But our development processes that have been implemented in countries such as Australia, the US, and the majority of Europe are based on corporations operating at a global level to produce goods at a cheaper rate that obviously leads to inequality, injustice, and human suffering, but also environmental concern. So EJ scholars argue that unrestrained capitalistic growth threatens the health and safety of people and all living things and ecosystems. Researchers who focus on capitalism and environmental justice often challenge the degradation of human rights under these processes and the degradation that this has on our planet. So there's some theories out there. The treadmill of production is a good one, but at the end of the day, EJ scholars demonstrate this connection between capitalism and environmental degradation and burdens as being central to the majority of environmental issues that we're seeing now, especially in the age of climate change. So basically, limitless economic growth and the domination of nature to ensure such growth have been the prevailing development paradigm in nations that make up the global north, and this ideology is promoted by neoconservative or neoliberalism based ideologies, and environmental justice scholars and the environmental justice movement challenge these models of development because they have been shown to operate at both international and national levels to sustain the economic and social quality of those who are white living in the West, but that comes at a cost for people who live in the global south or in developing nations. It comes at a cost to the planet, it comes at a cost to their human rights. And these are resulting in furthering issues of exclusion, poverty, and disempowerment of communities based on the idea that the West need to have continuous economic growth. So that's just something to consider in terms of capitalism and its connection to environmental justice. So the main takeaway I would like you to have from thinking about environmental justice concepts is that environmental issues affect people who are facing intersecting inequalities, and social inequalities that were pre-existing also shape environmental processes that lead to the unequal distribution of environmental harm and burden. Those of you who are interested, I recommend that you do look into these issues more deeply for your essays. There's a lot of interesting case studies you can take, specifically when we look at issues of disaster justice in the coming weeks, which I'll also be providing guest lectures for. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'll see you soon.